indications to the contrary. The promises of the great society have been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam.
I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
The enemy very deceitfully has taken advantage of the Tet truce in order to create maximum consternation.
This is Pleiku, 250 miles north of Saigon, the air base that was ripped by Vietnamese communist guerrillas. 8 Americans died in the attack that brought swift retaliation by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. From carriers and land bases, 49 jets struck back at staging areas just across the border in North Vietnam. The Red Guerrillas were able to slip by Vietnamese guards in the middle of the night raid and lob mortar shells into the area, while hand-carried bombs were placed under aircraft and against barrack walls. Why security was so lax is the object of 2 investigations, although some officers say full protection against such attacks is impossible in this jungle war. There is mute evidence of the toll the guerrillas took here.
I had a good friend go from there to Vietnam, and I said, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to Vietnam." I said, "Where's that at?"
Well, I remember hearing about how JFK, Jack Kennedy, was basically listening to his Catholic advisors saying the Catholic government was being threatened by these communists in the North, and we needed to go and defend his government. I think it was pretty corrupt, and I'm not quite sure why we felt we had to protect it, but it was during the Cold War, so anybody who was against the communists was on our side. But it really got bad, of course, when more and more people were getting killed.
My first introduction to Vietnam was, like most people's, was through the media, television and stuff. And it was pretty profound seeing it firsthand on television. And scary at the same time, because the prospect of us going there as high school students was, and a lot of friends, actually a lot of friends of mine died, and never came back.
I graduated from high school in '67, and you could not hear about Vietnam. It was on the nightly news.
Well, when I was in high school, I graduated in 1966, so the conflict was already going. It wasn't as intense when I was in high school as it was when I finally got there, but you know, we talked about it a little bit like in current events. We didn't actually have a history class on it. It was just a current event kind of thing. So we knew that a war was going on, people were getting drafted, and that's how I found out about it in high school.
I was 12, the beginning in the school, the bomb in 1964. They go in Hanoi and bomb in Hon Gai and Cam Pha. That's why we learn the school, we have to move out of the country. We cannot live in the city because the government scared, the bomb killed the young generation. And we move out of state, out of school.
I am amongst the baby boomer generation, and which means I was born at the end or near the end of, I was born at the end of the Second World War. And so that meant that in the 60s, by 1960, I was born in 45, so 65, I was 20 years old. 65 was about the beginning of the Vietnam War, and it was the beginning of a couple of other really major sociological events that happened in this country. The one that affected me was the San Francisco music scene, being from this area here. And so right all about the same time, you have to remember that the draft was active in those days, and when you were 18, you had to, by burden of punishment, register for the draft. So I read.
Well, I couldn't say exactly the date. I just became aware of it as a kid. I think when I was growing up, I read. We did have TV back then, and I watched network TV, and they were starting to show more and more images on the network news of it. And I was a pretty avid reader every week of this big magazine that we had back then. It was called Life magazine. I mean, you may have heard of it. It was pretty big. It's since gone by the wayside. But I can remember seeing vivid images of that, and I was 12, 13, I guess. That was 1962, well, 63, 64, I guess. Yeah, 13 and 14, when I was in freshman in high school. That's when I first became aware of it.
I got my draft notice 3 days before Christmas, 1966. Kind of like, Merry Christmas, Uncle Sam needs you to go to NAM. I wasn't too thrilled with that. However, I didn't think of, there was any other, alternative or option.
About 6 months after I graduated from high school, I was looking in the paper, and I noticed that my draft board, and I was living out in Contra Costa County at the time, not only had to come up with X amount, but they also had to come up with 30 some odd thousand people that month, which for the Vietnam War up till that point was a record amount. And I was able to call up the draft board. You could at this time, and you can literally ask them if you're going to be drafted. So I called them up, and I told them I noticed in the paper that, my draft board, it was their turn, and they had to come up with so many people. Am I going to be drafted? They asked me for my name. They put me on hold for not long at all, and they came back and told me, yes, that your induction papers were processed, and that they were going out in the mail, and that I'd be receiving my induction papers within 2 weeks.
The first part was what's considered, you kind of had to ask permission during the daytime to shoot your weapon to make sure you weren't shooting innocent civilians. At night it became what's known as a free fire zone, which means that if anybody was outside your wire, outside your perimeter, you didn't have to ask permission to discharge a weapon. Up in the northern part of South Vietnam, the whole area was a free fire zone 24 hours a day, so the decision to fire my weapon was totally up to me and the unit that I was with. And along the DMZ, that's where I saw real combat. The air base, we got rocketed and mortared a couple times, but primarily they were not trying to kill us, they were trying to destroy helicopters. So once they hit helicopters and they stopped, I didn't worry about it anymore. But out in the DMZ area, there was, I guess, man to man. They were trying to kill us, we were trying to kill them. And so it was combat. It was a combat zone. It was free fire. It was we were probably engaging the enemy. I'd say on average once every week, once every 10 days, we were in actual firefights and dealing with the enemy. There we were fighting North Vietnamese Army. They were uniformed, well trained. They had good weapons. They were organized. They had mortar and on occasion rocket support, some artillery, very little artillery, but mostly mortars. And usually when we engaged them, for the most part during the operations, we were outnumbered, and we consistently were the superior force. So.
Never had any hand-to-hand combat except in a bar. And of course, then I also have to tell you that we call these things R&R ports, rest and recuperation. So you're coming out of a war zone, and you'd be, behind the lines in some place. Either it was the main city, or you seen it in the Philippines, you seen it in Naha, Okinawa, and you had these red light districts, and those are very dangerous places. And the reason is because people there knew that they were going to die. You had whatever your billet was, your job was, You know, they had it timed out as to what the life cycle of that job was. It says if you're on a black boat in the river patrol, or if you're on a loading crew on the dock, by grade, if you're a lieutenant or a sergeant, and of course the higher you were on the ground, the shorter your lifespan. And those kinds of things are scary. You talk about 19, 18-year-old kids. 22 is old, And so when you're in these R&R ports, it was very, there's a term for it, case acida. It's very live for today, very, what's the word I'm getting old? I can't think anymore. There's a perfect word that describes that, because it's about now. Mm-hmm. Everything is about now. There's no consequence tomorrow. There's nothing that anybody can do to punish you, because any amount of punishment really keeps you out of the line of fire. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. And so it's like living with people with no inhibitions. Yeah. So it was a very wild, wild place. And strangely enough, I enjoyed that. There was an honesty about it. A peculiar lack of neurosis about it. That might be one of the good things about war. Everything's very real. There's very little bullshit around it. But that's about all that you might know like that.
Well, I think it's funny because usually the closer you get to going home, the more you realize that there's things around you that could really kill you. So it's not that you can become paranoid. It's just that it seems like everything seems to happen. The closer you get ready to go home, more things are happening. And this was just before Tet, and it was in October of 1967, and I had the two closest encounters I ever had of maybe getting injured or not being able to make it. And one of them was because the Viet Cong kept mortaring us more and more often. We decided to have a ready room set up with a helicopter that was ready to go, fully armed, and the crew would stay in the ready room. And as soon as we got alerted that mortars were coming in, we'd pop in the helicopter, like I mentioned earlier, and take off. And we would have a forward field artillery observer with us, and he carried a starlight scope, which kind of illuminated you could see in the dark, basically. And then we would call them into positions, get our own artillery to fire back on these guys. Well, I had about a month and a half ready to go before I was coming home, and I was kind of awake. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was thinking about what car I was going to buy when I came back to the States. I was thinking, a 67 Mustang Fastback with a 390 and a 4-speed, green, And I was kind of just awake. Everybody else was asleep. And I had my head on the pillow, and I heard the first mortar come in. Boom! And after almost 2 years, you can tell what's coming in from what's going out. So I jumped up, and I yelled, mortar, mortar, mortar! And I shot out the door. And right out, about 5 feet from the door, was the main bunker. And I had our helicopters was sitting on the pad, about maybe 50 feet from a ready room, and they had a drain ditch that was about 3 feet wide, with a little bridge over it. So I ran across that, and I just about got to the helicopter when the next mortar hit one of the other helicopters and destroyed it completely. And we realized the mortars were coming down on top of us. So the commander, when he came out, he realized that too. So he just said, everybody hit the bunkers. Well, I was already way away from the bunker, so all I could do was turn around and run back, and I jumped into this drain ditch. And the drain ditch had about a foot of water in it. It had just enough water in it so it would come over the top of my boot and soak my feet. And of course my butt was sitting in the water. And these mortars were coming down all around me. And they were exploding in front of me, and the shrapnel was whistling over my head, and it was going through the tin roof of the building behind me. And you could hear the explosion, and then you could hear ding, 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 as all these little pieces of shrapnel were perforating the roof. And I thought, shit, one of these mortars is going to land right in my ditch. I just had that feeling it was going to land right in my ditch and kill me. I'd be really pissed because I wasn't going to be able to, buy my Mustang. I wasn't going to be able to go home. I had all this money in the bank from flight pay and combat pay and hazardous duty pay and overseas pay. which came out to about $360 a month at that time. So I was sitting there listening to them hitting and going off, and then I heard, it's a funny thing about mortars, when they come down, they're spinning and they make like a little whistling sound. It goes, and when I heard that one, that little I knew that was going over my head, which means that what the Viet Cong were doing was they were just running the mortars down a row, and they'd set up a pattern. So they weren't going to drop any more in front of me. So as soon as I could hear them going over my head, and then they explode, and then I hear them go over my head, and a little bit longer hear them explode. So I knew they're getting further away from me. So the commander heard that too, and he said, "Okay, everybody back in the ship. Let's get to the ship." So they don't know what happened to me. I mean, they're all in the bunker, you know, under about 14 feet of sandbags and iron plates, and I'm sitting in this drain ditch with wet feet and a wet butt. So they come out, and they don't know if I'm alive or dead or what's going on. So they go running out, and I pop out of my little drain ditch there. And they look at me, and Jerry, the crew chief, he just looks at me. He's got this big grin on his face. He's just shaking his head like, "You stupid shit," you know. So, but the thing is, they were glad to see that I was still alive. You know?
Right.
So, and then a few minutes later, we're back up in the air, and we're flying around and looking for these guys. But the attack was pretty much over by the time we got out.
But we saw them coming in at night, so we knew there were VC in the Ville when the company moved in the morning, as there were. And there was a bit of exchange of fire, and not much happened really. And then, but what became readily apparent to me, and why I'm telling this story, is at that point in time, for myself and others, it became apparent to us that it didn't matter to the civilians, the peasants at that point, whether the VC were coming in and beating them up and stealing their chickens, or the Vietnamese were coming in with the Americans, or whatever, in the morning, and beating them up and stealing their chickens. They were still getting beaten up, and their chickens were getting stolen. I mean, it was really a no-win situation for the people in the countryside. I mean, it really, just the senselessness and of the whole thing became readily apparent.
We had a bomb attack, and they always put the medics near the airport, and they're always bombing the airports. And we had bunkers set up outside of our hoots, that we call them, and we had an air attack. It was like sometime in the morning, and we all had to run out to the bunkers, but I had such a hangover that I just crawled underneath my little hooch, and everyone who ran out of the bunker got killed, and I was the only one left in that unit. So that's about the third time I've talked about that experience.
Where I got on a crowded bus, there was one seat left, I sat down and made another stop. I looked up and down when I got on the bus, I got up and gave her my seat. That's what you do where I'm from. But my American counterparts on that bus gave me hell for giving that gook a seat. And I found myself in an altercation. You know what I'm saying? Because there's no way I was not going to give my woman that seat, having experienced the Rosa Parks story in the United States of America. I could see those parallels.
So we got there, and the point man, we crossed the creek, three of us, one after the other, and the point man went straight, the cover man went to the right, and I went to the left to check out the area and for booby traps. And I was moving along the edge of this high bamboo just up off the creek there. And there was this little bank. You went to the other side, went up a bank, and it was over. So the rest of the platoon was back across and down lower. But anyway, so I went to the right, and I was walking along, and I felt my left foot go down soft on the ground. That the ground was soft as I stepped down. And then I heard the little ping, which was the booby trap detonating. And I had just enough time between that little, it was like as you're walking, it just happens very simply, just the foot went down, touched, you hear this little ping, And then just before it exploded, I just enough time before it exploded to realize I'd stepped on a booby trap and I was getting blown up. And then boom, it blew. And it blew me up on the ground. It didn't detonate directly underneath me. It was just to the front, down low, slightly to the right. It was the North Vietnamese equivalent of an American Claymore mine, which is really blast and designed just to incapacitate people, not necessarily to kill them. And it's all full of shot, and you angle it up a little bit, and it just puts out this big fan. It's kind of like, you know, strapping 100 shotguns together and boom, letting them loose. So it's all shrapnel and blast. And through the shrapnel, they were able to identify there was a North Vietnamese device. Some of the pieces they took out. Anyway, so boom, I got hit. It went off. I started getting through, went up into the air. My eardrum perforated, blew out, and I went blank for a little bit, and I came down, and I landed on my back. And I came to right away, pretty good, pretty much right away, and called for the medic, and started checking myself out, which is what you do. Yeah, you do it at the end of the day, you do it whatever, anyway, at the end. And so I was laying there on my back, and I couldn't move anything except my neck and my head. So I rolled my head to one side. I think I looked to my left first and saw my left hand and arm. I knew that I had that. And I rolled to the right, and I saw my right hand and arm and knew that I had them. I could see my legs, so I was laying on my back, and I looked down, took my head up as far as I could, and I looked down across my chest to my body to see my legs if I could. And I saw the toe of my right boot sticking up. So I figured I had my right leg still.
Christmas for me, Christmas Eve, even though there was sort of a sense that maybe there might be a truce on, we had to be out in the field. So I spent Christmas Eve out in the field. Because I did, a few weeks later, when our battalion got the word that somebody was going to get to leave the field and go back to the rear and see the Bob Hope show, my company, because I had been in the field at Christmas Eve, got to go back and see Bob Hope. They just pulled, just like the ice cream day, they just pulled us out of the field, picked us up, and flew us back in the middle of the war to see Bob Hope. They flew us back in 3 big Chinook helicopters. And en route to seeing Bob Hope, one of the helicopters crashed. So we had, I don't know, 50, 60 men dead, lots of men injured, big mess. It wasn't my helicopter. We all landed by this big amphitheater and waited to see Bob Hope. We took off our weapons and put down our rifles, and we're just standing there in this big field, and there's cheering and yelling going on. It's like a football game. You come out of combat to see Bob Hope. We're waiting to go in, and we're waiting for the 3rd helicopter to arrive to pull the company together. And that 3rd helicopter, en route, crashes. And then one by one, it crashed as it was landing. It crashed near us, but too far away to see. So one by one, men start to arrive from this crashed helicopter. I mean, bloody men. Blood on their, they're talking about men dead, and they've got blood, and their eyes are big, and everybody's blown out, and one by one, they start arriving. And we're just standing here going, what the hell's going on here? And then this bigger bunch of people come. And they've got an officer with them, who I don't know. And he comes, he starts talking to me about what has happened. And all these men are dead, and all these men are bloody, and all these men are here, and all of a sudden I realize he's talking to me because I'm senior lieutenant. I'm in charge of this company now. So these men, plus all these bloody men, and we're gonna go in and see the Bob Hope show, as if nothing has happened. All these men are dead. I gather the company together. We go in and see the Bob Hope show. We see Raquel Welch and Miss Whirl and the Go-Go Girls and the whole show with thousands of troops. And then we come, then it's over. We come out, pick up our weapons. I'm company commander. We go right straight back to the field.
You know, when you ask me some of my experience, what always comes up for me is the fact of carrying a body and a piece of the limb, our arm, our leg, you know, in order to save the body to put it back together. And, you know, I've thought about this over the years, and it used to depress me, but now I feel very good about it, because I think that it's a healing process, and I smile inside every time I think about this horror experience that I have of trying to save a life.
The World Without War and all these little old ladies would give us some money, and we needed that money. We'd run flyers, and that was before photocopy. You know, we had the Mimeos and these Ditto machines and stuff like that to make flyers to hand out. And that was a kind of this is part of history. We really should say it. So the Berkeley draft resistance group had maybe $600, and then one of our officers was selling marijuana on the side. To me, he was kind of a rough guy. And he was selling marijuana, and he got arrested. And his friend came to my apartment one night and knocked on the door and said, I need all the money from the resistance. I got to get David out of jail. And I said, well, that's not what this money's for, man. That's a different problem. And the guy was going to beat me up.
Yeah.
And I can remember my girlfriend at the time, we were like in terror. And I gave him the money, and then I had to go to the full resistance meeting and tell him what happened. It sort of broke our group up. And that was, I think, the early spring of 1968, the winter of 67, 68. And so the Berkeley group, I don't know, was effective after that, whereas the Stanford group continued for a couple of years to beat the resistance.
Well, originally, I was taking a film class at Drake High School, and originally, I mean, it was an easy way to cut class, number one, to go to these rallies and stuff. But also we figured, well, this might be an interesting way to meet girls too. But once we got there to these rallies, we saw that thousands and thousands of people were demonstrating, and it was just became real evident that this was something more significant, you know, and something we need to pay attention to.
I marched a couple of times in San Francisco. It's hard for me to remember specifically. I remember one being, I think I cut school. It was in April. It was right around my birthday. I think I was 17. And I did get in trouble for cutting school, but my mom, you know, I explained to my mom what was going on, and it was okay with her. And I just remember being amazed that there were so many other people that felt the same way I did. And it wasn't only just other people that were hippies, there were all kinds of people there that were starting to speak out against the war. And but it was a little frightening too, because there was all these cops on horseback and stuff like that. And if I remember that there wasn't any violence, but I was always afraid of that sort of thing, because we had seen things of violence. I think it was that same year there were, well, maybe it was that summer. I might be getting these mixed up because of the dates, but of course there was all the riots that occurred during the Democratic Convention. about the war, and we saw how the cops in Chicago just creamed people, you know, and they would wail on them and beat on them. And
we got out there early, you know. They were saying, oh, the idea was to block traffic so people couldn't get to work, so to shut down the government in Washington. And so we got out there really early, and it was there wasn't any traffic, and we were just kind of doing civil disobedience, pulling garbage cans into the street or whatever to block traffic. And the cops were out, in force, and so we got picked up right away. And they weren't especially mean or brutal. I didn't get beat up or anything. I mean, I know people that did get beat up in different demonstrations, but in that particular demonstration, we just got herded into a police truck and taken to jail and sat there for about 12 or 16 hours until they finally let us go.
I went back to my hometown out by Diablo Valley College, Pleasant Hill, and myself and 4 or 5 other people began, or just going around, the parents hated us and the teachers hated us because we would go to the high schools and give 17 and 18-year-olds resistance literature about, opposing the draft and opposing the war. And we put on a couple of symposia, DVC, workshops, and there'd be people for the war. It was really kind of good, we had debates and arguments. And that was about a year.
But at any rate, I decided that I had to figure a way to get out that wasn't the violent protest. I decided that I would act as if I was crazy. And I thought about that a lot, and at the time it was a pretty common experience for people to be talking about ways to get out of the Army. And I had a friend who was an artist who lived just down the road from me in the mountains, who had gone to his pre-induction physical as what he called Dirt Man, where he had put Elmer's glue, mixed it up with dirt and other things to make, and rubbed it on, put it on his face, and to make him look very dirty and kind of unkempt. And he had, not washed his hair, he had long hair, had worn funky clothes, and a long trench coat, I remember him telling me. And he didn't really ever make that physical. He had to fly from where he was to the physical. He missed the plane, so his preparation was in vain. At any rate, he gave me the idea that I could use just sort of a form of makeup in order to make my skin look different. So I sat around in my cabin in the mountain with some friends the night before my induction physical, and I mixed Elmer's glue with, I decided not to be Dirt Man, but I realized I could make it look like another layer of skin, on my body. So I mixed the glue with, at this time it was called Kirkwood's peppermint oil soap. It was a liquid soap, it smelled like peppermint, had a lot of coconut oil in it, and it was supposed to be, in those days, when it was sort of the first health food soap in the 60s. And I mixed that up several times until I finally got the mixture just right, mixed it with water and the soap, and applied it to my skin. And I got it on my face, and I started by experimenting on my arms, and I found that I could get it to look like skin, but skin that was very kind of shiny and, taut, it really made my skin look like I had some strange disease. And so once I got the mixture done properly, I stayed up all night, I remember, and I had long hair at the time, and I didn't wash my hair. I put on a very funky old t-shirt that had paint all over it. It was done by an artist friend of mine. It's kind of a palette t-shirt. I had a pair of very thick glasses at the time that I had used when I was in college working in an automobile factory in the summer. They were safety glasses, so they were very thick and primitive looking, but they were non-prescription, and I didn't need glasses at the time, so I could wear them, and they made me look pretty strange, actually. So I took the bus down to Denver because I didn't want to be accompanied by anyone. I wanted to appear at the induction center kind of alone and lost, and my whole plan was to act completely insane. I wasn't sure how I was going to do that, but I wanted to look very bad as well. So this glue man thing that I did seemed to be very successful, because as soon as I got into the induction center, I was handed, as everyone is, a basket and told to stand in line, and then you get to a certain room and you take your clothes off, and then you get put your clothes in the basket, put your basket away, and then you go through the physical. And as I was standing in line acting crazy without being, without ranting and raving, but twitching and acting odd and looking apparently very odd, a lieutenant came up to me and very gently took me out of line and said to me, the psychiatrist comes in at 8:30, and when he gets here you can see him and then you can go home. So I knew right from the beginning that I was in good shape. I was probably going to not have to go in the Army, and I decided to play it for all it was worth. So I went into the lieutenant's office where he brought me in there and sat me down, and I was left alone in there. So I had cigarettes with me at the time, and I was smoking cigarettes, and I decided to start doing kind of radical things like putting them out on his desk or on his blotter. He had a stapler on his desk, and I started stapling things together and stapling things to the blotter and scribbling and scratching my head and acting weird, and thinking that maybe somewhere someone was watching me. Eventually he came back and took me out of the office, and to my surprise wasn't, angry or upset about the mess I'd made in his office. So I think he felt genuinely sorry for me. So eventually he said to me, well, you need to go to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is on the other side of the base, and you have to take a bus there, but I'm not sure you should take the bus. Maybe those two long hairs over there will give you a ride, because they have to go see the psychiatrist too. And he pointed to two hippie sort of characters that were also having their physicals. So I went up to those. So he said, why don't you go ask them for a ride? So I went up to those two hippie guys, who in those days pretty much all hippies were friends of other hippies. So you expect you get a ride for they would always pick you up hitchhiking. It was easy to connect. If someone had long hair, you knew they were probably pretty much thinking like you. It was before long hair became really popular. So I asked these two guys. I said, "Hey man, can I get a ride over to the shrink? I've got to go see him too." And they kind of looked at me for a second, and I said, "Sorry man, you're too weird." And they declined to give me a ride. So now I know I really must have looked pretty convincing. So these two hippies wouldn't give me a ride. So I went back to the lieutenant, and he said, "Oh, well, that's okay. We'll give you the directions for the bus." He wrote down the directions, which bus to take and where to get off, and he gave them to me. He made sure I could read them. And then he sent me outside, and across the street from the induction center was a bus stop. And so so I sat down on the bus at the bus stop and started to smoke one of my cigarettes that I had made, specially laced with hashish. Popular substance at the time. I then sat on the bench smoking and waiting for the bus. The first bus that came along was the bus that I was supposed to take. But I got up and I noticed there were people watching me upstairs, a couple of people in the window, and I went to the bus and I kind of got on the bus and then I got off the bus and I sat back down on the bench and the bus pulled away. And every subsequent bus that came along, and there were about 10 of them before the same number bus came around again, I would either get on the bus and off the bus, or I'd walk up to the front of the bus and stare up at the sign in front of the bus, and then look down at the piece of paper and up at the sign and down at the piece of paper, and scratch my head and go sit back down again, and the bus would pull away. And as I sat there on the bench after each bus would pull away, I noticed each time I did that there were more people in the window upstairs and watching me, to the point where by the time my real bus finally came back for its repeat visit to that bench, the entire top floor of the induction center, which was about 15 windows, every window was full of people watching me and doing this thing in front of the bus. And so I finally got on the bus and got to the psychiatrist's office. When the psychiatrist saw me, he just basically stared at me for quite a while, didn't say anything at all. I just sat there kind of scratching, and when I would scratch my hand or my arm, the skin would, the the applied skin made from this peppermint oil soap would flake off onto his desk in big white flakes of, looking like skin. Finally, he said to me, and the first thing he said to me, he said, "What's that on your face?" And I said, I was answering whenever he would ask a question, or anyone would ask a question, I would always take a long time to answer and talk in a very slow and disoriented fashion. And I finally said, face, oh, face. And I scratched my head and found a little bit of the skin, and I pulled off a little strip of it from my forehead, and I looked at it like this, and I put it in my mouth. And I said, skin, and he started writing immediately. And then he asked me questions, and I took a while to go through the interview, but, basically what do you do for a living? And I told him that I lived in the mountains and I chopped wood for my friends and they gave me food. And, in a roundabout way, I never answered any of these questions directly. And, he'd ask me my name, and it would take a while to be able to even respond appropriately to that. So I was acting very, very disorientated. And after a while, he just said, "Okay, well, you can go." And I, ended up taking the bus back to the induction center. And when I got back there, the lieutenant was there. I remember him, he was a redhead lieutenant, young guy, very, very straight and correct, and very, concerned and caring kind of person. I was kind of surprised. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't rude. He seemed to be very nice. Anyway, he said, "No, you can go now, but we'd really like you to eat something before we send you off, because we think you should have some food, So here's a meal ticket, and if you wait a few minutes, you can have some food first, and then you can go." So I felt then obliged to wait around and continue my act and have some food. So I did that, and I ate something, and then I left the induction center. And that was, in those days they were giving, they had stopped giving what was called a 4F, which was a complete deferment from the draft. And they were giving dated, I think they were called 1As, which meant that you were ineligible for the draft for a period of time. And when I finally received mine, it was a 1A but with no date on it. So it was basically the same as a 4F. They didn't want to see me again. So that's how I got out of the draft. It wasn't a noble enterprise, but it was efficient, it worked, and it served my purposes, and it kept me out of Vietnam. And there was one less body on the line, and I felt completely fine about doing it that way, as opposed to trying to take the noble cause and be a conscientious objector.
I was so surprised when finally I was drafted, and had so many people have burned their draft cards, but most of them didn't tell the government they did it, or you could burn a draft card, but unless you're in the process, if you're staying in college back then, you're not going to get drafted. So unless you leave college and expose yourself to the draft, and then go through the draft, and that takes months. So what if you burned your draft card? It was just a show. And eventually, after many, many months of waiting, I was drafted, and as I explained, I actually got on the bus in Martinez, which was our home draft board for Contra Costa County, and was handing out flyers to all the other guys. And, like most of them didn't want to go. And so one guy sitting next to me told me he was very Christian, very religious. He felt that it was his duty to, from his Christian standpoint, to obey the government, but he didn't believe in the war. And got to Oakland, refused to go across, was interviewed by the FBI guy, and then kind of waited to be taken off to jail, and it took a year and a half or so.
We were really sort of products of the generation gap children, the sort of rebel without a cause generation, and we somehow came together in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and discovered that we had a lot of stuff in common, and most of it, at least for me and for my involvement in the music scene, and I think for this I probably speak equally for all of the Grateful Dead members. We had a vital interest in our music and developing it and where we could go with it and what we could do with it. So we viewed, I think probably more than anything else, honestly, the concept of the Vietnam War was really potentially more of a distraction than anything else. I don't think that any of us really had any particular opinions one way or the other, whether we were for it or against it.
And I had a big old sign, and I was starting, it was really, in that winter of '68, I was starting to get less and less nonviolent pacifists and starting to get like, yeah, we've got to stop these people. And I had this sign, and some fraternity guy comes crashing through our line, and I swung around behind him, kind of swung my sign, hit him over the head with the cardboard part. Next thing I know, I was being arrested. And it was really interesting. It was this really nice University of California police officer, and he said, you know, I've been watching you the last couple of days. You've been getting more and more antagonistic, and I'm going to arrest you right now before you do something stupid. He was really kind of, I look back on it.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to that guy. He was probably 20 years older than me. I don't know if he'd be alive. But so then I got thrown in Berkeley jail for a couple of days. And then, so I had that record, and I can remember finally when I came up for whether I'd go to trial or plead guilty on that, swinging a stick, which was really a poster at a guy, I was really starting my trial for in the federal government. And the Berkeley judge, Superior Court, just said, well, we've got enough other people to work on. He just threw my case out. So that was the end of that.
So one morning we got up and we stayed at this motel. It was really cold. It had been snowing. And we went into the diner next door at the truck stop, and there was a big sort of horseshoe-shaped counter, and there was only about half a dozen other people in the place. And we sat down on the counter. And some guy across the way, there's two guys across the way, and one of them got up to the jukebox and he played a song that was popular at that time called I'm an Okie from Muskogee. And it was a pretty southern song, and it was all about how the lyrics in it were about how they were patriots and they don't have long hair and they hippies and they don't burn the flag and all this stuff. And you know, I mean, I heard it before. I didn't hate the song, but you know, I just thought it was a stereotype that it wasn't necessarily true. But it played over again, and it played over again. This guy obviously put in, I think it was 2 songs for a quarter. He put in a couple of quarters. I think he'd done it deliberately to annoy us. So I think the 4 songs ended, and we were about halfway through our pancakes, and I turned to my friend Kit and I said, you know, I think this calls for some revenge. And I went over to the jukebox, and I looked through, and there was Neil Young's Ohio, which is all a protest about the killings at Kent State University. And the big chorus lines, 4 dead in Ohio. So what was so I played that song, I put in my 2 quarters and punched that button, whatever it was, you know, E12, hit that 4 times. And so it's got a pretty ringing guitar beginning to it. And about the 3rd time I went off, someone got up from, one of the waitresses got up and unplugged the jukebox. So that was, you know, that was one of my quiet protests against being discriminated against, I guess.
So 2 friends and I got in a Volkswagen and drove to the Grand Canyon and took acid and watched the snow fall, and then drove to Lompoc Penitentiary over 4 days. And I walked in there, and the prison was filled with people looking out the windows. Guys, he's turning himself in, don't do it. And they're all in there. It was hilarious. And it was I was in for 11 months, and my daughter was born while I was in there. And I didn't get married before. We got married when I got out. I got out next year in the fall of 1970. And there was plenty of things going on, but when I got out of prison, was into nature, into getting a job on a farm, and I took maybe 3 years before I did anything but try to figure out how not to get in a car. I was not at all concerned after that about anti-war activity.
You know, I had a cousin that was in Vietnam and got a Purple Heart. He got shot, and I mean, he survived, but he came back. And, you know, so it was always mixed. You know, it's like originally in the anti-war movement, it was sort of like, you know, people were burning their draft cards, and there's a lot of anti sort of soldier sentiment. I think, you know, just that why are people doing this? You know, but I think as people's consciousness was raised, that, you know, why do people go to war? It's because who serves in the military? It's people that don't have a lot of options, you know. People that couldn't get out of the draft because they could get college deferments, or they didn't have, you know, their parents didn't have enough money to have the connections to get them, out. So I think there was sort of, coming to a class understanding that, people in the military were victims also, and that they weren't the enemy, that they were being used by the system as cannon fodder, and that they, the sort of the motto of support our troops, bring them home became the sort of the changing perspective. And I think, it's really true that you support the troops by getting them out of there, that, they don't belong there. The war is wrong, they shouldn't be there, and that it's important to support the troops by bringing them home.
I really thought that there were a lot of people who were foolishly signing up for the war. I didn't dislike people. As a matter of fact, a lot of my high school friends, when I would go back to visit, which wasn't often, but when I would go back to visit, especially before this experience at the draft board in the 66, 67 period, I was always talking to them about the war and the unjust cause and the fact that it was illegal and we shouldn't be messing around in other countries' affairs, and we had no right to be there, and there was a propped up government and the whole issue around the war. And I tried to convince them not to go. And and I can remember a friend of mine saying, "I just want to go over there and kill those gooks," And some people were just gung-ho, and I didn't have a lot of respect for people that thought that it was a good idea to go to the war. I mean, I thought it was naive to think that war was a game, and I think a lot of people were programmed to think that and did think that. And I can understand it more so then than now, in that World War II was still fresh in most of everybody's memories, from the standpoint of they were born just after it and knew about it because of their father's involvement or someone in their family's involvement. But at any rate, I think it seemed to me a very clear-cut case. This particular war was not right, and so I didn't despise people, but I thought it was. I did think that they were foolish and rather naive to think that they needed to cooperate in this way with the government.
The United States of America, through the protesters, through the politicians, handed defeat. In other words, we were defeated in the end to the North Vietnamese as a result of the lack of resolve and willingness to follow through on a victory that today General Giap freely admits we had. Think about it. The general in charge of the North Vietnamese army freely admits, and he's done it in his books, that they were defeated. He freely admits this. He says that it was the American people who provided the victory for the North Vietnamese. Now think about that. And think about it in the context of what you see going on in Iraq today. We were this close to total victory in Vietnam, where we could have had a settlement, we could have forced them to the negotiating table, and because the American people turned on its soldiers, turned on the politicians, turned on our resolve, decided we wanted to get out. In the end, we sold out the South Vietnamese people, and that's why we had such an influx of people from South Vietnam into this country as immigrants.
But they didn't understand what was going on. They blamed us for a lot of things that never happened. We took the brunt of public opinion, being service members, doing our duty, doing what our country asked us. But by the same token, that was their right. That's what we were fighting for. That right of freedom to express ourselves. And we do that today. We don't like it, but it's their right, and they have a perfect right to do that. As long as they don't turn violent. A peaceful protest is fine. We don't like war. A veteran, I've spent a lot of time in war. I don't like war, but there's times it has to happen. That's just human nature in life, and we got to take care of the warrior.
During that time, I served 2 years in Vietnam, and I came back to the United States to Bolling Air Force Base for a 3-month additional training. And I made the mistake of Washington, D.C. and wearing my uniform in D.C. and I got spat upon. I was called all sorts of names, a buddy and I. And that was sort of it took me some while to get to digest that. Again, I spoke about being patriotic. I felt I was unpatriotic. I felt they had no idea what was going on over there. I think people are more informed about what's going on in Iraq than they were about what was going on in Vietnam. And I was bitter. I was bitter for a while against anti-war protesters. I was bitter against Jan Fonda at the time, going to Hanoi. But I began to understand that when if I in my which I call awakening, and I call it an enlightenment, that war is stupid, then I understood what the anti-protesters were about. There's a lot of, in fact, I had 3 friends, close friends, that I was in school with, that went to Canada to avoid going to Vietnam. And I was bitter toward them for it. But, again, as you grow and understand, each person has his own choice to make.
I felt they were trapped. They had to go. I didn't feel that they were bad or wrong. A lot of them came back and they were spit upon or downtrodden because they volunteered. They didn't volunteer, but they committed themselves to doing that whole process. And I think that's a shame because they're veterans. They did, put their life on the line. But I think they were doing their job. They were doing what they were told to do.
I can remember going to parties and being around Pleasant Hill with guys who were going AWOL, guys that had gotten back who had lost a limb, who'd lost friends, and I met a couple of guys who said they had been spit at when they were in uniform, but most of the guys I met, they got their uniforms off before they ever left Vietnam. They hated it. They were as anti-war as I was. And since that time, I've had many a conversation with guys that have been to Vietnam and have felt a sense of relief that I had gone to jail because it allowed me to feel like I paid a little bit for that era.
For me, because the South Vietnam, we have freedom before, that way after the communist took over all the South Vietnam, we don't have freedom. That way, for me, that's why I'm here, that's why I'm in America, And that's why all the time I hustle, one day, my country, freedom the same before. The war end, and my father go to the prison because he decided South Vietnam military. That's why he had to go to prison, When they tell my father go to the jail, but they didn't say the jail, they say the camp, you know what I mean? But they say only 1 month, but 9 years. Yeah, 9 years, my father 9 years in prison. When he left house, he's so big, he tall, but he came home, he's so skinny and so small because, the reason not good, they're not good food and work so much, they use them a lot. I think for most of my people, that's why they left the country because the communists treat them look like they work hard but they don't got to pay rise, don't pay good enough, that's how they got the freedom, They different a little bit with here. Look like here, I can say, or look like somebody called me in the phone, said, you want to vote for, are you Republican or Democrat? And I said, I'm not Democrat and I'm not Republican. Did you vote for President Bush? I said, I don't like a President Bush. I don't vote for him. I can say that, it's not problem. And the communist, they very, you cannot talk. Look like you cannot say who good or who not. That I don't like it the way the communist way. I like it the freedom here.
It's not your country, and you don't know the language, and you don't know the culture, nothing. Different weather, so it's very, very difficult for me. And the bad part, the sad part is I didn't come with my parents. I came and I was little, so it's very hard for me, and I have to be independent and grow up and take care of my brother.
When I old enough, I joined to the Vietnam Air Force during the Vietnam War, and we fight for about 3 years, and the communists won the war, and I can't stand the control under the communists. I got to leave Vietnam. We escaped on the small boat at the midnight, and we came to Malaysia. We stayed in a refugee camp for about 1 year, and then moved to Philippines about one more year before we came here.
I was a refugee, so when I come over, when I took over our country, escaped our country, I feel happy because we have a freedom. Even when we have in a refugee camp in the Thailand or Philippines, almost about 10 months, we still, even we very suffer, poor, but we still happy we have a freedom. And after we come over USA, we real shocked. Look, like I told you, we have a problem with the language. With English is a second language. We can talk very well, so that's why we have a trouble. But at least we thank U.S. government, thanks all American people. They help us with a lot of programs, look like the welfare, look like the AFDC, something like that. They help us at least for the beginning time. So that's why we can step up, we can build up. So we just say that we have a lot of problems when we come in here. And also we just say thank you, U.S. government, help Vietnamese people on the first time when we come in here.
I did go into San Francisco, and things were, I didn't really get eggs thrown at me, but you noticed that the people were sort of standoffish to you. They didn't welcome you home. They didn't, just like you didn't exist. People I know in all my life that were my hometown, it's like I was on a vacation. No one said anything, no one talked about it. It just shut us down.
And he says, "What happened to you?" And I says, "I stepped on a booby trap." And he says, "Oh, you dumb son of a bitch, why didn't you walk around it?" And that kind of like set the tone for my months at Valley Forge. It was the best of times. It was great times. I mean, this is how I came back. I was thankful to have it. In a sense, I was all shut up. I couldn't walk. I couldn't stand. I couldn't see out of one eye. I couldn't use my right hand fully. You know what I mean? All this kind of stuff. But at the same point, we were there, and we were in the Army, but we were out of the war. It was over. This was as worse as we were going to get. You know, we weren't going to die. You know, whatever, for guys that lost limbs you'd lost. Whatever you'd lost, and chances are you weren't going to lose any more. You were stabilized, and it was just you were there to get back as much as you could.
I came back January 20th, 1968, and you know, it was a great day. Came home with my squad leader and our platoon radio man, a couple of guys that I was in the field with. So we came home together. We had the same flight out of the field and coming home. So I came home and landed in El Toro. Had 20-day leave, which was bizarre to be pulled out of a war zone and actual firefight, and in less than a week I was sitting at home in front of a TV watching the news about stuff that was going on in a place that I was just at.
I'm going through custom, and they opened my luggage and everything, because every average military person had to go through custom just to make sure you're not bringing any weapons back, you know, and what have you. And in my luggage, I had 2/5 of Chivas Regal and 2 cartons of Winston cigarettes, all sealed, and everything. So the guy said, "We're going to have to take your Chivas Regal because you may have some, you know, stuff in there, and we have to send it to the lab, and we'll test it, and we'll mail it." I said, "Forget it, you know, take it." And so I got discharged. I went through this whole 2 days at Travis Air Force Base, and I kept this incredible smile on my face, because what they didn't discover, those 2 cartons of Winston cigarettes, they were hash, full of hash, these 2 cartons. So that's how I survived coming back in San Francisco after getting out of Vietnam, is smoking hash.
As we came home, I know I was on a plane out of El Toro, flew into San Francisco International. I got off the plane, walked out front, I was kind of waiting for a ride, and ended up staying there about 3 hours because my ride had difficulty getting there. And I remember one mother walking by and grabbing her child and snatching her away so the child didn't walk close to me. She was, watch out for him, he kills children. And it just, it's something I'll never forget.
There was an image in this country of crazy vets. And we're all familiar with that, particularly at that time. And the whole thing with killing baby killers and stuff like that. The thing that's traumatic for a combat soldier is that you're faced with stuff. We're all crazy and we're all insane, but it's not in the image of the combat, of the returning veteran, that, well, insane man. We're crazy because at times we were just confronted with situations where we had no frame of reference as to how to respond to them. Physically, emotionally, morally, they were just totally whacked. You know, they were just beyond anything you might have imagined or felt or experienced. And the insanity was just finding yourself absolutely groundless with how to respond. So that's one of the things that people brought back. When I say we're all crazy vets, but we're all crazy vets because of the combat vets, because we've hit that point where we've been confronted and a participant in a situation where we just don't know what the point of reference is, physically, morally, politically, emotionally. You know, you're just overwhelmed totally by it. And that's what a crazy vet is. That's someone who's experienced that.
I believe that when I was there that we were doing the right thing, and I still believe we did the right thing. We could have won that. We did win that war. Okay, we never lost Vietnam. We never lost one battle, one engagement, one anything. We never lost one. Not one did we ever lose. But we had political garbage going on where they micromanaged the war from Washington, D.C.
I think that a lot of veterans come back to the United States and expect something in return and never get it. And which, again, I'm beginning to recognize that the country doesn't really know how to take care of veterans once they get back. Because the average veteran, or the average military personnel, go into the military, they learn a trade, they learn how to do various needs of the military, and when they get discharged, there aren't any comparable jobs to those jobs that they had in the military. And that's where the frustration sets in, the depression sets in, drugs and alcohol begin to take its toll on the veterans. And a lot of veterans that I work with are mostly IV drug users and heroin users.
And so we came back without, and that was, I think, one of the, in terms of returning, that for me was the most unfortunate thing. And it's stuff that I had to go back through the, therapy at the vet centers to kind of reclaim, to sort out, the stuff, because of the, and own, the part of me that was effective and save people in many different in different ways, and that's And so I think these guys and now in the future will be able to hold on to that. It'll change them, but it'll make them hopefully more
It
compassionate.
just shows you how powerful our vote is, how powerful we as Americans can determine our future. Right or wrong, we made a choice as a country, and we abandoned those people. We abandoned the sacrifice of over 58,000 Americans on a whim, without really having all the facts. And to this day, that's probably what outrages me more about my country and my government, is that we did that to Americans, and we did that to those people.
And I think we're all tainted, and I think to the tainted point we're tainted, that none of us will really be able to, whatever we did can always be twisted, as we just saw in the last election, the Bush-Kerry campaign.
Came home and accused all Vietnam veterans of unspeakable horrors.
John Kerry gave aid and comfort to the enemy.
My feelings on John Kerry is I'd never trusted the man. I don't care for him. He did his fellow veterans a great big disservice in 1971 when he went before Congress at the Winter Soldier investigation, what they call Winter Soldier investigation in Washington, D.C., told Congress that our soldiers in Vietnam were committing atrocities, cutting off heads, ears, killing women and children constantly. Never happened. Of course things happen. There's collateral damage in a war. That's going to happen, but it was not on the scale he put it out, and it was not like we were barbarians. We did more good in Vietnam. We did a lot of, we did medical aid, we built schools, we took care of people. You never hear about the good we did.
And John Kerry was also a founding member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and his whole testimony about the issue of atrocities going on in Vietnam is what I think made him so controversial. There's a huge issue here about the responsibility of the chain of command, holding the chain of command accountable, and the fact that there were a lot of atrocities that went on that were kind of swept under the carpet and not paid attention to. Everybody knows about My Lai, but there were lots of other situations that, you know, if they weren't quite that bad, they were still pretty bad. John Kerry tried to point at that, and he tried to point at the fact that the chain of command, and a big part of that the middle part of government, the bureaucracy of government, has not been held accountable. And for it, you know, he suffered. A lot of the veterans and a lot of people felt that John Kerry was a traitor. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think he's pointing out to a problem that's very real, needs to be addressed, and we just haven't gotten there yet. As a country, we're not ready to actually look at it and deal with it.
And we obviously don't learn from our history, because you've got Abu Ghraib, you know, and that whole thing with, you know, the prisoners in Iraq or prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and the ones that are taking the rap are just the little peon, you know, sergeants and privates and corporals at the low level, and you're not really seeing a whole lot of brass really getting their knuckles rapped and take the rap for it.
The struggle goes on to try to, you know, solve differences nonviolently and to make sure everybody has enough to live, and that there doesn't have to be a super rich class that kind of lives off of the folks at the bottom. So I guess I'm still a radical at heart. I just haven't gone out and got arrested lately.
After the war, I was angry for a very long time. Now I have some more perspective. I don't know what I think about, I really don't know what I think about Johnson and McNamara. I have a general sense of American culture, that we are pretty violent, that we don't see much beyond our noses. We have a righteous sense of who we are that doesn't really match up with reality. And we're willing to kill a lot of people in order to get what we want. And act like we're doing the right thing in the process. We're doing it right now.
The legacy of Vietnam is that everyone associated with that war is tainted. I really just have come to believe that. We're just tainted. And no matter what our experiences were there, they can be used against us.
I want to start a campaign, and I'm learning out how to develop a legislative piece. But I don't think I want a slogan or a campaign that no veteran or a veteran's family should be homeless. It's a disgrace. It really is.
I wouldn't wish anybody right now having to go into the military, given the circumstances that we all live under right now. But I also understand how freedom needs to be protected, and what sacrifices our generations before us have had to make so we could have the freedom and liberty that we exercise today. And there will always be times when countries will have to require people, their citizens, to make those type of ultimate sacrifices if they're to remain a free society. It's how your government chooses to exercise that kind of power that really needs to be debated. And I think coming from the Vietnam War generation, it's very much meaningful to people like myself because of the experiences that we had back then and the people who we knew personally that had to make those ultimate sacrifices.
Port, hard. Ready. Aim.